Welcome to the Going Green podcast, and today we're looking at dengue fever coming to a country in Europe near you.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, it's not just actually dengue fever. It's quite a few sort of infectious diseases which are often carried by things like carriers like mosquitoes, and they are basically because of climate change changing where they live. So instead of living in I don't know, the tropics, they're moving out now into more temperate zones, both north and south equator, as the climate is changing. And this is going to bring a whole load of new diseases that countries in Europe and perhaps in America and other places didn't suffer from, and now soon they will.
Yes, and we're not talking about, say, when there's let's say a natural disaster like a massive flood with then sort of diseases caused that way. We're not talking about those sort of diseases. We are generally talking about, say, the mosquitoes basically moving up because they're not their habitat, but they live at a specific. I'm not saying range of temperature, but
Yeah, they do.
they do. It's one of those things. And of course, if that temperature range geographically moves, then of course that's where the mosquitoes want to live because they're filling in the void of where they go. And if it expands, which is what we're talking about through climate change, of course, then the mosquitoes will expand to fit the
Yeah.
new environment.
Mind you, actually, there is some good news in the climate change, which sounds really stupid. But if it gets too hot, then the poor little mosquitoes can't survive. So you might find that in certain places where they're now, they might not be able to survive as well. Unfortunately, it's got to stay hot for sort of forever, basically. And so if your place doesn't stay hot all the time, then you're still going to get the mosquitoes. Anyway, so what is dengue fever? People sort of talk about this and it makes the headlines, but basically it's a virus, it's a viral infection, and it's caused by the dengue virus called the DENV, and it's transmitted to humans by the dreaded bite of a mosquito. So very similar to sort of malaria, but it's actually carried by a different mosquito. And about half the world's population now are at a risk of dengue fever. And there's a phenomenal sort of between 100 and 400 million infections every year, which is, it was really frightening.
Yeah, it's. But one of the more important things about getting, I say, if you do catch dengue fever, is that although 75%, of the people who get infected, uh, they don't get any symptoms from it. It's very not. I won't say safe. That's the wrong way to describe it, because you know. But if you catch it, it's not life threatening. But however, it's one of those things where 1 to 5% can have a severe, nearly fatal, apparently, reaction to this, which is, of course, very bad. So when we're not talking about is it huge and dangerous, as I said, malaria is actually more dangerous, but that's a different mosquito. But
And that could still be coming to a country near you as the temperatures change. They require a little bit more to sort of make them move. Dengue fever, the mosquitoes that carry that, can live in more temperate zones. So at the moment, certain countries in Europe are finding that they're suffering from dengue fever, such as Croatia, France, Italy, Spain, places like Portugal and Madeira. Italy. Did I say Italy? I can't remember.
yeah,
Yeah, anyway, so Italy, not necessarily twice. But basically, at the moment, where I live here in the UK, we can't catch dengue fever from basically the mosquito. And of course, you can't catch it from another person. So basically, it's spreading, and it's spreading because of simply climate change. And is it sort of a really nasty disease? The answer is, well, basically, no, not too bad. But about 1 in 20 people who get it could have real
Yeah,
problems.
which is sort of what I was saying.
Yeah, yeah. And they get things like shark internal bleeding and sometimes death. Uh, there are quite horror numbers, though, for the number of people that basically get that. And if you live in this country and you're aware of all our sort of NHS problems at the moment, then an extra problem given to the NHS by having sort of outbreaks of dengue fever, well, that's not going to be very helpful. So, what's causing some of this? Well, one of the things is we're going to get an El Nino. I've been watching
Dun,
the
dun,
weather on
dun.
this, and not only do you get it sort of 1 year, but it actually sort of builds up, and it's on part of this oscillation cycle, which basically can mean that the temperature just change, and basically dengue fever is going to increase, and things like hurricanes and floods are also going to follow as well. So, you're not going to suffer one thing, it's going to be suffer by multiple attacks of different things.
Yeah, it's, as I said, it's one of those things where we're hearing about the reports of uh the higher temperatures, and it's the higher, more rainfall. It's all those sorts of things, and it basically is the movement of getting, you know, let's say you have a disease that's communicable only in sheep from mosquitoes, and suddenly you have sheep and cattle and cows together, and suddenly you could find that disease moves from a sheep to a cow, and then it's one of those things where the difficulty of it moving from those two animals to a person is actually much lower. Yeah, we saw that coronavirus, how that can be just instantly done and found out. But it is this idea that it is the climate change is creating more pathways, shall we say, for disease transmission, as opposed to any sort of it's creating new diseases, which I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying because that's how, because diseases are adapting to the climate. But it's more, currently we're at a phase where it's actually a geographic changes as opposed to biological changes. And that is, of course, due to climate change because, of course, of how the temperature ranges and the climate of where people are living. Well, there's not much you can really do apart from, shove a large ice bag over it to cool everything down. Um, but
That's not going to be probably the best solution for climate change. So,
it's a solution.
it is a solution, yes, but not the best one. Yeah, we're looking at the moment, half of all the known human pathogenic diseases are going to be aggravated by climate change. And that is really quite frightening. We're seeing a lot of these diseases that are carried by not just mosquitoes, but various other sort of vectors, as they're called, basically spreading wider as climate change sort of carries on. And although a lot of people put their sort of heads in the sand and say, well, yeah, but it's only 1 degree. It's not that much. That 1 degree makes the world of difference if you are perhaps something like a mosquito. And it's the amount of frosts and things that we have that basically
Yeah,
kill off these things.
it's as, as I said, it's more not being able to get the frost. It's not having those frosts, which kills things off. Like this year, we're saying that sort of, loads of plant species haven't really, um, they're not really died off because there wasn't a severe frost. And so, well, they just kept on living,
Yeah, if you look at the number of frosts every year, it's quite interesting to see that over the last 20 years, the number of frost days, and I can only talk from where I live, have actually noticeably decreased. And I notice those simply when I have to get up in the morning, go and take my wife to work, and I have to go out and I have to sort of thaw the car out and I have to sort of chip away the ice.
or more precisely, you don't have to do that as much.
No, and I haven't. And that's what's been quite noticeable is that sort of how many mornings I haven't had to do that. And that shows that we've got less frosts. And it means that poor little insects who were struggling now can survive and they can bring these human pathogenic diseases to you.
Mm.
Yeah,
But
that sounds quite nice, really, isn't
But
it?
one of
Sort of
the
quite
other,
friendly.
yeah, I know. One of the other things associated with it is actually things like uh, bacteria are also having better conditions to live at. I mean, we're talking things like I say Lyme disease. It's a bacteria causes Lyme disease. So it's that bacteria, and basically because of how people can catch it and it's sort of not being killed off, as we were saying earlier, not being on the frost and those sorts of things. It's spreading more. I wouldn't say rapidly. That's the wrong way to put it. But of course, yeah, I think that people are going hiking. Usually, it's killed off, and they touch the things, and that's how they're getting it. And then, obviously, then they're spreading it because, of course, they don't know it was there in the first place. And this is how we're catching it out. And as I said, these things are curable by antibiotics, and we're not saying that's an issue. But the major issue is suddenly you go from every 1 in 1,000 people wanting that antibiotic to, of course, 10,000 people wanting an antibiotic. And
Yeah.
the answer is, can you treat it not fast enough, but it's the regular sort of prescription of having these antibiotics to get rid of all these diseases, cure the illness.
But I will point out there that antibiotics will only get rid of bacteria. They won't get rid of viruses like dengue fever. And so if you've got dengue fever, all the antibiotics in the world won't help you. Basically, you've got to go for, if you need them, antivirals. And in fact, most people cure themselves from most virus diseases. But it's an arms race, basically. It's a race. The virus has infected you. Are you going to win or will it win? The virus really, if it had some sense, which it doesn't really want to kill you because then it can infect you again and again and again and it can raise its numbers. But of course, it doesn't know that. So sometimes it doesn't do that and they go through uh, vast populations. And we look at COVID, how that spread. Now, that wasn't due to climate change, but that's also due to the fact of sort of wonderful transport that we can sort of move around the world very quickly. So, unlike the Black Death, which took probably about 200 years, I think, to
Something
cover the
like
world.
COVID did it in a week.
Well, yeah, 20 days probably,
Something
yes, or
like
something like that.
But
Yeah, it's a problem, and if we're getting more diseases spreading, then things like dengue fever, because they're spreading because of climate change, then that also means that perhaps things can sort of
other things
things can happen.
happen.
Yeah,
Yeah, and we're although we're not directly talking about the risk of, say, extreme weather events bringing in things, sort of, we're talking sort of flooding and then causing bringing in cholera. But there's a not a distinct link or how things go, but it is one of those odd things where the extreme weather is bringing these events. You think of how many things get washed up and pull through, trying to capture all these, not diseases, but you know,
Well, it isn't just diseases. It is basically weather causes hurricanes, floods, and those things damage the basic infrastructure, and therefore hospitals and things aren't so readily available, and then more people die of these diseases.
so yeah, and people are looking at these things. People are looking at establishing the links between, say, the caseload and sort of the environments of, let's say, you know, with increasing temperature moving across, and that's well, that's that science alerting you and trying to make reports and identify problems and sort of working out strategies such as, do we need to import more things when it's extreme, like let's say when hurricane season arrives, let's say in America, just for instance. Do they need to make the provisions of, right, we know there's going to be more flooding and there's more cholera, therefore we need to get in the treatment for cholera in.
Yeah, which is
It's
antibiotics. Yeah,
it's the premeditation of, when you say it's now hurricane season, that's when you say, let's ramp up antibiotic production, that sort of thing. As opposed to, of course, if the hurricane season wasn't as long, as in it's being made longer by the climate change, then of course, then what we're saying is, can it, when you ramp up your production, you're ramping it up, and then you have, say, a month off, as opposed to making it 24/7.
well, this is where something like dengue fever does really well, and dengue fever does really well because you bring in hurricanes and floods and other things, and that leaves a lot of water lying around. And mosquitoes, they like water. They breed in sort of water. Their little larvae sort of live in the water. And they can live in not just sort of things like rivers and lakes, but quite happily in puddles. And they can sort of there produce enormous numbers of mosquitoes. And then they can spread dengue fever all over the
Yeah,
place.
it's quite happily, yeah.
And I'm just using dengue fever as an example here. This is one that sort of hit the news because people think it's sort of really bad, and you
Well,
hear all these horror stories. Yes, but a lot of people, when they get dengue fever, don't even know they've had dengue fever, but it can kill.
yeah, and it's one of those odd things where usually you hear quite a lot about having, when you go to a third world country, having to get, say, of your vaccine shot for the diseases in that country, and that's fair enough.
But you may need them now just to stay in lovely England.
Yeah, well, as I said, the point I was making was that list of diseases, or the countries where you have to get the antibiotic or the antiviral shot, whatever shot of stuff, it could be expanding because those diseases are spreading further. And the reason is because of, say, the habitat or the local environment. I read I'm trying to remember what it is, but
Yeah.
as we say, it is it's the spread of being able for those things that live there, the vector platforms that they live off, whether it be food or whether it be um, you know, zoo zootropic.
Yeah, zootopic. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, basically animals is what I'm trying to say. But it is the idea that because they move around and the fact they can then spread where you meet things. If you've got like lots of cows meeting and sort of from all sorts of two sides of a country, they share diseases because, well, they're mixing, and then that causes problem because, of course, if they're two different climates or their climates are now becoming very similar, are they really going to be moving? Or you might be finding, daftly, that they actually move into the better environment away from the hottest one, because as things get hotter, of course, too hot and dengue fever actually dies out, which is one of those dumb things. But it's going to find that right Goldilocks zone. We might be finding that Goldilocks zone not be pushing forwards, but it's moving, geographically moving. And so places where you might have a vaccine shot or thing, they might say, "No, don't need a vaccine shot anymore. It's the virus isn't like here anymore. It's next country over." And so you're having to, and that's being monitored and made sure that, of course, you know, we're safe and happy and sort of it's known about so we can track these things. But, you know, one of the things is, of course, they are not tracking these things, but they are learning sort of, as I said,
Yeah.
with the dengue fever, we've had, not outbreak we had, that's the wrong way to put it. You know, it was like one person, but it was more they got tracked and work out by the UK Health and something organization. It's the one that I know.
Yes. All right. Okay. Yeah. Um, One of the problems I was saying was that you get increased water can mean some more mosquitoes, but in fact, reduced water because of temperature change also causes more problems. Generally, it's related to poor sanitation, and then you're seeing loads more diseases go up. Um, so there's lots of nice ones there. I can throw a few names at you, uh, but like salmonella, cholera, chlamydia, uh, but typhoid as well.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
there are loads, all due to lack of water and lack of water and generally poor sanitation. Too much water, and you get a whole load of other diseases coming.
yes,
So climate hazards, I suppose we could call them, are really generating a whole load of different risks of diseases because of the climate infrastructure is basically sort of being modified, changed, I suppose.
yeah. Well, another important fact about all these sorts of things is actually us, let alone the diseases changing a thing, is us. And I say this in relation to, let's say, if you've got a respiratory problem, the more likely you are to catch a respiratory virus. And so, what aggravates your respiratory problems, of course, is things like pollution,
Yeah.
and it's those sort of ideas. You know, with the people are they're saying people with a increase in asthma as a population, you know, more people are having asthma problem related problems. They're actually finding that respiratory problems or more diseases it's going up, and the major reason is because more people have respiratory problems or asthma, and so the disease or the bacteria of virus and a couple of fungi ones, but yeah, any respiratory disease
Yeah.
has a more easier chance to attack on I wouldn't say healthy lung. That's the wrong way to put it, but yeah, not very an unhealthy lung, shall we say? When we're not talking sort of classic smoker's lung for being unhealthy, we are talking about asthma and sort of
Well,
yeah,
things that have got a viral,
well, it's
fungal, or
well
bacterial sort of
exactly,
origin.
but it's things like let's say allergies, flare up, and suddenly your body's fighting off the allergy, which it shouldn't be because and so suddenly your immune system is weaker, and therefore that's how you can get infected. And it is these things of you know people are having more allergic reactions to things.
But they are directly related to climate change.
Yes, and
And we can see this uh, spread of things like influenza, SARS, COVID, rotaviruses, the noroviruses are all related to basically warmer conditions. And this is a big problem. There will be, in fact, some diseases that will go down, but basically, most of the nasty ones, the big ones, are basically all sort of quite happy living in warmer climes. So basically, we will see some go down, but we're going to see a lot of others really rise up. And this is going to put a terrific sort of strain on not just our National Health Service, all health services, round the world. And we've got to think about, what we can do. And the only way we're actually going to really control this is not deal with the symptoms, as it were, having all these different diseases, but actually curing the problem, which is let's stop climate change. And at the moment, we're only talking about reducing this effect of climate change. We're not actually talking about reversing this and going back to where we were in, I don't know, 1850s or something.
Yeah, I know. It's one of those odd, sad things, how it goes through. But of course, as we know, one of the major things by um, having all these diseases, is and having problems for the system is actually, of course, the social economic effects of these things. And as I say, if you're having to constantly try to treat a disease, it's in sort of out of control. Whereas if you can prevent the disease from coming or prevent the disease arriving, then it's you're actually it's cheaper in the long run to prevent as opposed to treat. It's the classic thing of sort of, do we need to start looking at potentially thinking about putting up mosquito nets all over the place? And that's something you don't think
Think
about.
about, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but potentially in the next sort of 50 years, going to have this conversation of, do we need to sort of put the netting over windows when you in the summer when you're open to prevent the mosquitoes coming in, or those sort of things, and
And that's for places not that suffer it now, but it's places that will suffer it. So places like lovely England that doesn't have a mosquito problem will have a mosquito problem. We looked at in March 2022, the give you the right name for you for a change, Paul, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. They said without swift climate action, we're going to see an escalation in these infectious diseases. And we're seeing it.
yeah,
And basically, because in a year since they put this report out, we haven't seen any swift climate action. We've seen very slow, sluggish climate action, if any. And basically, this is meaning that, well, while you're procrastinating, the mosquitoes, the other
they're spreading,
vectors are spreading. Yeah.
and suddenly you go from contained to full rampant spread. Just think how problematic was in treating COVID was because of how much it was spreading around. And you think, COVID was a small, understandable little disease, singular disease. But what if it's suddenly 20, I say diseases, all sharing this very similar, not panel, but same similar vectors or the areas of vector. We're talking about, say, waterborne ones as opposed to not waterborne ones. And suddenly it is those things of, we could be seeing other diseases follow through, such as we start with dengue fever, that then drives up, and behind dengue fever, of course, that brings in malaria, which,
And lots of others.
yeah, and then we're just saying sort of, then it's one, then we have, everybody's just cured dengue fever, and then everybody's now having to deal with malaria, and one of those diseases is curable and the other isn't.
Yeah, we're talking about some things like dengue fever are endemic in sort of tropical climates. And what we're worried about now is, are they going to become endemic in the
Oh,
more temperate climates?
yes.
Because the temperate climates won't be temperate for much longer. Yeah, it's a worry. And basically, it's something that people don't necessarily think about. They think about climate change, they think about it getting warmer, but they don't necessarily think about these ramifications that, yes, infectious diseases like dengue fever will increase. And it's not a case of they might, they will.
Yes.
You've been listening to the Going Green podcast, looking at how climate change can make infectious diseases probably a little bit worse. Next time, we'll be back with another item on Going Green. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Bye bye.
Bye.